The night my uncle handed me over to pay a debt I didn't know existed, he wore his best coat. That detail stayed with me longer than anything else. The fact that he'd pressed it, buttoned it to the collar, like he was attending something that deserved a little dignity. I was 26. I kept the books for his import business out of a strip mall in Brampton, Ontario. Not a glamorous job. Not a job anyone would miss. I sat in a back office that smelled like printer toner and old coffee, and I tracked every dollar that moved through Rennick exports, legally and otherwise. I knew which invoices were real and which ones existed only on paper. I knew about the shell accounts in Halifax and the payments routed through a cousin's landscaping company. I knew because Desmond, my father's brother, the man who'd taken me in when I was 17 after my parents died in a highway pileup outside Kingston, had taught me the system himself, trusted me with it, said I had a gift for numbers. What he hadn't told me was that those same numbers had buried him. I found out on a Wednesday in February. He called me into his actual office, the front one with the fake plant and the framed photo of himself shaking hands with a city councillor he'd since bribed. He sat down behind his desk like there was a script he was working through, and he told me there was a man named Vael who was owed $800,000, and that the debt had been accumulating for 3 years, and that Desmond had run out of ways to defer it. "He wants a bookkeeper," Desmond said. I remember looking at the fake plant. One of its leaves had a small tear in it from when a delivery box had knocked it sideways the previous Christmas. I'd never bothered to mention it. "He wants one of his own," Desmond continued. "Someone who can manage accounts the way we manage them. Someone trained." I understood what he was saying. I just needed a moment to confirm I understood it correctly. "You're giving him me," I said, "as settlement." Desmond didn't answer right away. That was its own kind of answer. "It's a position," he said. "You'd be paid. You'd have." "Don't." I stood up. My chair scraped back loud enough that the receptionist out front probably heard it. "Don't dress it up." He didn't. He sat there in his pressed coat. He'd had it on already, I realized, because the meeting with Vael's people was that afternoon, and he let the silence do the work. $800,000. 3 years of bad decisions. And me already trained, already vetted, already complicit in enough that I couldn't exactly go to the authorities without implicating myself. It was tidy, the way he'd arranged it. I had to give him that. I didn't cry in his office. I waited until I was back at my desk, alone for a few minutes while he made phone calls, and then I sat very still and looked at the spreadsheet open on my screen. A column of figures I'd been reconciling before he called me in, and I thought about how much of my life had been handed off without my consent. My parents gone in 40 seconds on a dark highway. 17, handed to an uncle I barely knew. Now 26, handed again like an asset being transferred between accounts. The only power I had in that room was how I walked out of it. I closed the spreadsheet. I saved my work. Force of habit. Then I went home to my apartment in Mississauga, packed what I could fit into a rolling suitcase and a backpack, and waited for whatever came next. What came next was a black SUV, 2 men who didn't introduce themselves, and a drive north on the 400 that took just over an hour in light traffic. It was dark by the time we turned off onto a private road that cut through bare February trees. The property at the end of it was not what I'd expected. No gates with gold crests, no ostentatious architecture. Just a long stone house set back from a frozen lake. Lights on in several windows, smoke coming from a chimney. It looked almost like someone lived there. Inside, a woman named Hartmuller. She gave only the last name, walked me through a short list of rules with the tone of someone reciting a building code. No phones for the first 2 weeks. All correspondence reviewed. I would have my own room, take meals when and where I preferred, and report to the main office at 8 each morning. I would not be harmed as long as I did not attempt to leave or communicate outside the network without authorization. "That last part," I said. "That sounds like something someone says right before they harm you." Hartmuller looked at me without expression. "It sounds like that because people in your position often don't take it seriously. I'm being specific so that you do." I took it seriously. My room was on the 2nd floor at the end of a hallway that smelled like cedar. The window looked out over the lake, which was frozen solid and moonlit and very quiet. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, not crying, past crying, just cataloguing. $800,000. Wednesday in February. A suitcase and a backpack, a window overlooking ice. I opened my backpack and pulled out the one thing I'd packed that wasn't practical, a small green ledger I'd bought years ago at a shop in Kensington Market and never quite managed to throw out. I'd used it to track personal budgets, grocery costs, the occasional thought I didn't want to lose. I opened it to a blank page and wrote, Day 1. That was all. I didn't know yet what to put after it. I met Vael on my third day. I'd expected the introduction to be staged. A formal meeting in some room designed to impress or intimidate. What happened instead was that I was in the office at 7:45, 15 minutes early, trying to get my bearings on the filing system, and he came in without announcement. He was taller than I'd pictured him. That was the first thing I registered, purely physical, before anything else. Broad-shouldered, with the kind of stillness that doesn't come from calm but from discipline. The stillness of someone who'd learned early that movement gives things away. He was somewhere in his late 30s, maybe 40, with dark hair threaded slightly at the temples and a scar along his left jaw that disappeared into the collar of a grey shirt. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow. He was holding a coffee. He looked at me for a moment without speaking. "You're the Rennick bookkeeper," he said. "I'm Lydie," I said. "The bookkeeper part is accurate. The Rennick part I'm finished with." He didn't react to that exactly. Something in his expression shifted slightly. Not surprise, not amusement, just a kind of recalibration. He pulled out the chair across from the desk I'd been working at and sat down. "Show me what you've found so far," he said. "I've been here less than 3 days. I know." I turned the monitor toward him. In 2.5 days, I had reconstructed the partial account structure I'd been given access to and found 3 discrepancies that didn't match the ledgers. Payments flagged as equipment procurement that had no corresponding inventory entries, and a recurring transfer to a numbered company in Quebec that appeared in records dating back 4 years but had no documentation beyond a client code. Vael looked at the screen for a long time without saying anything. "The Quebec transfer," he said finally. 16 payments. Total approximately 2.3 million. No contract, no correspondent entity on file, no tax record. "What do you think it is?" "I think it's a leak," I said, "but I don't know whose side it's on." He looked at me then, actually looked at me, not at the screen, and I held the look because I had learned early that looking away was how people decided you were manageable. "The people before you," he said, "didn't find it in 18 months. The people before me weren't looking for it," I said. "They were looking for what they were told to look for." He stood up, took his coffee, and left without saying thank you. Hartmuller appeared 20 minutes later and told me my access level had been upgraded. I went back to the numbers I understood. Everything else I was still figuring out. The leak had a name by the end of the week, a name connected to the numbered company, connected to a property in Gatineau, connected to a man inside Vael's own network, a logistics coordinator named Prentice, who had been skimming for 4 years and had gotten sloppy in the most recent quarter, likely because he'd assumed no one new was looking. I put the documentation together in a folder. Clean, cross-referenced, annotated, the kind of work I'd been doing since I was 19, and Desmond had set me down in front of my first set of dual-entry books and told me numbers don't lie. People do, but numbers don't. I left the folder on the desk in the main office at the end of a Thursday. Friday morning, Prentice wasn't there. I didn't ask what had happened to him. I had a reasonable idea, and asking would not change it. And the alternative? Doing nothing, letting the leak continue, allowing myself to be the person who saw it and said nothing, was not something I was willing to be. This was the calculation I made. I was here. I hadn't chosen to be here, but I was going to be useful while I was here, or I was going to be nothing, and nothing was not survivable. Vael came to the office himself on the Friday afternoon. "You could have buried it," he said. "Why would I protection? Insurance, something to bargain with." "I'm not interested in bargaining," I said. I'm interested in a clean set of books. He sat down across from me in the same chair as before. He had the folder in his hand. You know what you've walked into. I have a working hypothesis. Then you know what happens to people who play games inside this structure. I'm not playing games, I said. I found a discrepancy. I documented it. That's what you brought me here to do. If you wanted someone who would hide things, you had the wrong person before I arrived, and you still have the wrong person. He set the folder down. Looked at me. Rennick said you were stubborn. Rennick said a lot of things to protect himself. He wasn't wrong about that one. I didn't answer. He picked up the folder again, tapped it once against his palm, and stood. There are 3 other accounts I want you to look at, he said. I'll have Hartmuller give you the access. He left. I sat there for a minute, alone in the office, looking at the lake through the window. Still frozen. A crow had landed on the ice at some point during the conversation, and was standing there with an air of complete indifference. I went back to work. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. That's the part that's hardest to explain. Not the extremes, but the ordinariness. The way a situation becomes normal, not because it is normal, but because the human brain requires a ground to stand on, and it will build one out of whatever's available. I kept the books. I ate breakfast alone, and occasionally dinner in the kitchen with Hartmuller, who turned out to have opinions about hockey, and a dry sense of humor she deployed rarely, but effectively. I slept in the room with the view of the lake. I wrote in the green ledger most nights, not entries exactly, just notes, observations, the way the ice changed color in different light, the specific sound of the house at 3 in the morning, which was almost completely silent, but not quite. I was not a prisoner, exactly. I was not free, exactly. I occupied some category that didn't have a clean name. Vael was in the house often, but not always. When he was there, he would sometimes stop in the office, ask a question about a specific account, look at what I was working on. He did not make small talk. I did not expect him to. Small talk felt like it would be in a different language for both of us. What happened instead was more like translation. Incremental and careful and sometimes wordless. He would stand at the window while I explained something, watching the lake, and I could tell by the way he stood whether he already knew what I was about to say, or whether it was new information. I started reading him the way I read a column of figures, looking for the pattern, the variance, the number that didn't fit. Once, about a month in, he asked why I'd never tried to contact anyone outside. Hartmuller would catch it, I said. You could find a way around Hartmuller. I thought about that honestly. I don't know where I'd go, I said finally. My uncle's the only family I had. My apartment's been cleared out by now, I'd guess. My professional contacts are all through Desmond's network, which means they're in this world anyway. I paused. Running would mean starting from nothing. That's not impossible. But it's not obviously better than staying and finding out what this is. That's a cold calculation. I make cold calculations, I said. It's more or less what I'm for. He looked at me then. Not the measuring look, not the recalibrating look. Something else. No, he said. It isn't. I didn't know what to do with that. So I filed it, the way I filed things I didn't have a category for yet, and went back to the numbers. The category clarified itself slowly. A conversation here. A silence there that stretched in a particular direction. The night he found me still in the office at midnight, going through the Quebec Connection's chain of shell entities. Because once I start untangling something, I find it genuinely difficult to stop. And he brought 2 cups of coffee without being asked and set one beside me, and sat down and read through what I had so far, quietly, for 20 minutes, before saying, "The 3rd tier is a trust, not a company. Look for a probate filing in Ontario, probably 2019. I looked. He was right. It changed everything about the structure. How did you know that? I said. Because I set up a similar one in 2017, he said. For different reasons, I looked up from the screen. He was looking at me. There was a quality to the light at midnight in that room. The desk lamp, the lake dark outside, the fire they kept going in the hall that stripped things back. He looked tired. Not the tired of a single bad night, but the tired of many years of specific kinds of decisions. You don't trust easily, I said. No, neither do I. I know, he picked up his coffee. That's why this works. I wasn't sure if he meant the accounting work or something else. I wasn't sure he was sure either. We left it there. But the next week, I had a phone, not a monitored one. He left it on the desk in the office without explanation, and I picked it up and looked at it for a long time, and then I put it in my jacket pocket and went back to work, and I didn't call anyone. Not because I couldn't, because I'd meant what I said. I didn't know where I'd go. Here had become the most honest thing in my life, which was a strange sentence to be true of a situation I'd been handed into against my will. But honesty is where the numbers take you, if you follow them far enough. It was April when Desmond made contact. A letter, addressed through a channel I hadn't known he knew about, which told me something about how much I'd underestimated the shape of his network, or how much Vael's people had let through deliberately. It was 2 pages in Desmond's careful, self-taught handwriting, all the loops a little too neat, like a man who'd practiced looking precise. He wrote that he was sorry, that he'd had no choice, that he hoped I understood the position he'd been in, that if there was any way he could help me, if I wanted out, if there was something he could. I read it twice. Then I read it a 3rd time, slowly, looking for what I always look for, the number that doesn't fit, the variance, the entry that contradicts the ledger. What I found was this. Not once in 2 pages did he ask how I was. He asked how I was managing. He asked if I was safe. He asked if I needed anything. But how I was, as a person, as his brother's daughter whom he'd taken in at 17, that question was absent. What he wanted to know was whether I was a loose end, whether I was going to be a problem. I set the letter down. I thought about the pressed coat. I wrote back 4 sentences. I was fine. I was working. I did not require assistance. Please do not write again. I gave it to Hartmuller to send. She looked at it, looked at me, and nodded once in a way that I'd come to recognize as her version of a full paragraph. Vael was in the house that evening. He didn't ask about the letter. I didn't mention it, but at some point after dinner, sitting in the front room where there was an actual fire, and he'd spread what looked like shipping manifests across the coffee table, he said, without looking up, "You know you can stay." I looked at the manifests. "As your bookkeeper." That's not what I said. I sat with that for a moment. The fire made a sound like pages turning. "I don't do well with things that aren't stated clearly," I said. He looked up. "I know. So I'll be clear." He set down the manifest. "You are not an asset on a ledger. You were brought here as one, and that was wrong, regardless of what Rennick owed. You have kept this organization's accounts with more clarity and integrity than anyone I've employed in 15 years, and I would like—" He paused, which was unusual for him. "I would like you to stay because you want to, not because there's nowhere else." I looked at him across the coffee table and the manifests and the firelight. "That's still a pretty cold offer," I said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The beginning of one, maybe. "I know," he said. "I'm working on it." I looked back at the fire. "I want to renegotiate the terms," I said, formally. "In writing, of course you do. I want full access to all accounts, not tiered access. I want a salary structure that reflects the actual value of what I'm doing, with a cost of living adjustment and a clear statement of what I am not responsible for. And I want my name on the lease for this office, not a pseudonym." He was quiet for a moment. "The last one is a security risk. It's a statement," I said, "about what I am in this structure. I'm not a ghost account. I'm a person." Longer pause. The fire. The ice outside beginning to crack in the early spring warmth. I'd heard it in the mornings, that deep groaning sound, the lake renegotiating its own terms. "All right," he said. I looked at him. "All right," he said again, more quietly. "Draw it up." I drew it up. 3 pages, clean, cross-referenced, with a clause about dispute resolution that I was fairly proud of. He read it in full, which I appreciated. He initialed 3 amendments that he articulated clearly and without ego. We signed it on a Tuesday in April, at the desk in the office, with the window overlooking the lake. Hartmuller witnessed it without being asked. She made coffee afterward without being asked either. I was starting to understand how she communicated. The accounts I managed in the following months were cleaner than they'd ever been. Not because I made things disappear. I didn't, I wouldn't. but because I built a system that showed exactly what was there. A clear system is harder to steal from. It's also harder to hide behind. Vael understood that. He didn't ask me to blur edges. He asked me to make them sharp, and I did. There were difficult things. There will always be difficult things when you are keeping the books for an operation that exists outside the law. I am not going to pretend otherwise, or wrap it in language that makes it sound cleaner than it was. What I will say is that I knew what was in those accounts. I knew what they represented, and every decision I made with open eyes, not borrowed ones. That, too, was new. When you've spent your adult life in service of someone else's interests. First my parents, briefly, and then Desmond, by obligation. You don't always notice that the interests you're serving aren't yours. The ledger makes it visible. That's what a good ledger does. It shows you the actual weight of things. In October, 7 months after the night with the pressed coat and the black SUV, Desmond was arrested. Not by anything Vael's people had arranged, by a CRA audit of all things, triggered by a filing inconsistency in the shell accounts I'd helped build years ago and had quietly reported through an anonymized tip to the right office in March once I had copies of everything I needed and a clear view of what he'd done. I heard about the arrest through Hartmuller, who heard it through a contact who'd seen it on a regional news brief. Desmond Rennick, Brampton import businessman, facing fraud charges. No mention of anything else. The world is full of files that never get opened all the way. I sat with the news for a while. The lake was doing something beautiful that afternoon. Autumn light, low and amber, and the water moving for the first time since winter. Real surface movement, wind-driven and small. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to say that clearly because people expect triumph in these stories, and what I felt was more complicated and quieter, and honestly more like relief, like a column that's finally balanced. The kind of feeling that doesn't announce itself but just settles in, and you notice it because something that had been faintly wrong for a very long time has stopped being wrong. I wrote it in the green ledger that night, just one line. The account is closed. Vael found me at the desk at 6 in the morning 2 days later. I'd started early, I often did, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before coming in. "How are you?" he said. "Not how are you managing. Not are you all right or do you need anything. How are you?" 2 words. The question Desmond had never asked in 2 pages. I looked up from the screen. "I'm good," I said, and then, because it was true and I'd stopped rationing true things, "I'm genuinely good." He looked at me for a moment. Something in the set of his face that I'd learned to read over months. The quality of stillness, the specific weight of silence, and what it said was something he was still finding the language for, the same way I was. He sat down across from me. "The Garthia account," he said. "There's something I want to walk through with you." "Show me," I said. He set a folder on the desk between us. I opened it. We began. Outside, the lake was still and silver and entirely itself. And the morning came in the way October mornings do in that part of Ontario, gradual and cool and without apology. And I sat in the office with the man who'd become the most honest thing in my life, and I did the work that had always made sense to me in a world that finally improbably made sense too.